So as you can probably tell, the subject of this book, when you started writing it, didn't feel as critically relevant, politically relevant as it does now, acutely in a very uncomfortable way. And we'll get onto that. But first, I just wanted to start at the beginning. What was the inspiration for this? What made you want to write about this topic?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you to the museum and all the hosts for putting this event on. It's such a pleasure to be here and so great to see so many familiar faces and new faces interested in learning about these topics. I started thinking about this book actually because at my core, I'm a teacher, and I teach a lot of students who are medical students and who are also involved in scientific research. And we have been having these conversations over the years, particularly in the context of working in a social justice-oriented medical school, where people are very interested in topics related to equity and what can be done to reduce healthcare disparities. And in this context, the kinds of conversations we were having with these students were incredibly meaningful. They're just so well-intentioned and want to do everything they can, but they need the tools, they need a little bit of framework to kind of figure out how best to target their efforts. So we had been having these conversations, piecemeal at different points in their education. And I started thinking that I would want to bring them together in a single class so that we could have kind of a sustained full semester long dialogue about it. And so I was starting to think about coalescing all of this into a class for my students. Around the same time, Chloe Lehman, who's in the audience, my editor, she and I crossed paths at one of these post-COVID Zoom conferences that was happening. And I had shared a few short pieces that I had written related to equity in service of populations defined by race, ancestry, sex, gender, disability, a few different things. And Chloe was secretly in the chat clicking through these links and then sent me an email later on to ask, if we could have a meeting. And I thought, is this spam? And then I looked up her bio online and I saw, no, this is a real person. She's a very legitimate editor. And so
you can never tell these days. You have to be careful.
So that was the beginning of a great partnership, and it was wonderful to be able to write the book at the same time as putting the class together, because I was having this dialogue with students while I was putting my thoughts into words on paper as well.
Yeah. I feel now we've got the proximate reasons why you came to write this, but just going further back then, right to the beginning, and you do write in the book about the fact that you came from a family of scientists. Tell us more about your family story then and how you came to be a biologist here in Boston.
Absolutely. So my parents are immigrants from India. They were born pre-India and pre-partition, I should say. And so they were involved in migration kind of from the beginning. And when they came to pursue higher education, my dad decided he wanted to first study in Europe and then eventually came to the United States to study. And shortly afterwards, he and my mother had an arranged marriage and they came to the US as immigrants together. That was 3 years before I was born. And once I was born, we had settled then in central Pennsylvania, which was a primarily white area in central Pennsylvania. My dad had earned his PhD in chemistry. My mom had studied psychology, and she had done a few different jobs in the sciences over the years. So when we settled in Pennsylvania, they were some of the first founding members of the Bengali community in central Pennsylvania. So we were definitely in the minority when we were there, and we had to be comfortable, kind of talking about what things meant to us and what it was like to navigate spaces where we were outwardly very different. And so we had a lot of really open and honest conversations growing up, and I think...
So you and your parents talked about race and identity even from a young age? You were thinking about that?
Right. Because the racism and that feeling of otherness was very much at the forefront all the time. And so just that level of comfort and being able to acknowledge that what I was seeing was true, I wasn't imagining it, that I think gave me a certain foundation that I felt comfortable bringing it up with students then later on in my career, but it did take some time.
It's very unusual though, because I come from an immigrant background myself, and I feel that for that generation often they just didn't want to talk about it. They felt that they should just be grateful that they got to live in the UK or got to live in the US, and that these are just things that you have to live with, so just suck it up and move on. But isn't it incredible that your parents were willing to have those conversations with you? That must have felt reassuring for you, that they were acknowledging it, at least.
Absolutely, yeah. As I was kind of thinking through it, this idea that I wasn't making it up in my head, that real adults, my parents, saw the same thing. It was very validating, and it did give me that comfort level, to have these conversations.
Yeah, and I feel you can sense that in the way that you write about this topic, that there's an ease that you have with it, that you feel comfortable talking about the things that other people find very uncomfortable to talk about. I feel that they come more naturally to you. So just on the topic of the book then, there has been this perennial debate within the sciences, and in broader society for that matter, about what matters more, nature or nurture. So this biology question then comes in a lot when we're talking about race and identity. What is it that makes us who we are? Is it society and culture, or is it, is there a genetic component there? Is there a biological element? And this question really sits at the heart of your book. How much does underlying biology or genetics then shape who we are? Is there an easy way to answer that question?
This is a hard question, but I think the biology is just such a small piece of it all. I think people frequently overestimate how important biology is, when in reality, our family environments, the structural environments of our towns and the places we work and the places we go to school, and all of these things, they have so much more impact on what shapes us and our personalities and how we grow. And I think maybe a funny example of that might be when people started cloning cats. When you see this is a genetically identical cat, but it looks completely different, behaves completely different from the previous pet that they're trying to recreate. So I think the same is really true when you think about the biological underpinnings of us as humans and our identities.
But that's not what scientists thought for a very long time. There was this assumption, particularly I think it was at its peak in the 1990s, this idea that genetics is everything. We will find a gene for absolutely every social behavioral trait that there is. We can explain all of humanity using genetics, and it didn't really happen. Obviously, that didn't come to fruition. But how do you unpick that? Because it's a very difficult thing to unpick. You can't run controlled trials where you raise people differently depending on their genetics. How do you approach it?
It is a very complex field, and there's a whole group of socio-behavioral biologists that are trying to understand the genetic underpinnings of behavior. And I'm not trying to say there's no role for genetics in it, but these things, first of all, are never kind of single gene kinds of things. And then even if you do have a gene that might predispose somebody for a certain kind of behavior, or maybe a mental health condition or something like this, it may depend on if you've had a life event that can be an exposure event that can cause a certain chain of events to happen afterwards. So it's very difficult to tease apart all of these factors and how they combine in unique ways for an individual.
And there has been a resurgence of this way of thinking around the question of polygenic risk scores. So this idea that even if there isn't a single gene, there is a combination of gene variants that could contribute to certain traits. What do you think of that resurgence that we're seeing now?
Polygenic risk scores, also sometimes called polygenic indices, there's so many layers to using these. I mean, some of the polygenic scores are actually somewhat validated, and they can, if you're talking about things that are more kind of health-oriented or biological. But people have now started rolling out polygenic scores for behaviors, and are even offering them in the context of embryonic screening. And this has particularly been adopted by the pronatalist movement, where there's a desire to increase family sizes and to have more children, but children that fit a certain mold. And the mold that they're trying to recreate really is they want more white babies. They want babies that are of a certain intelligence, so they try to select for intelligence, but there's no single gene test that you can do that predicts that somebody's going to be intelligent. And I think the thing that gets lost in these conversations is that these polygenic scores, they're probabilistic, they're not deterministic. So it might increase your chance of a certain outcome, but it certainly doesn't predict it with any kind of certainty.
And even the predictions that are made on the basis of large statistical populations. So for any one individual, actually the likelihood of being able to predict anything falls down very rapidly. I remember once interviewing Robert Plomin, who's a famous psychologist in the UK, on the very hereditarian end of this debate, so the opposite side from you. And he said that he had a very high polygenic risk score for schizophrenia, but he didn't have schizophrenia. It kind of went against his argument. And that's essentially the situation that we're in, that even if you have this tendency or at least this statistical tendency that's indicated by this thing, it doesn't really mean that much to the individual.
Absolutely. And there's a story even for some folks who had engaged in genetic testing for their embryos for selection, where they had previously had 3 boys, I believe it was 3, who were autistic, and they wanted to select for a child who was not autistic. There's no gene for autism, that's a single gene kind of a test. But can you imagine, like, this child, if the child grows up to be autistic as well, then is that a disappointment? How does that make the child feel? How does it make the existing children feel that they were trying to have a child who's different from the ones they had already? There's so many landmines in every direction.
And why do you think that people are so drawn to this? Because obviously there are so many overtones of the eugenics movement here, this idea that, we can breed the perfect baby, we can create the perfect human being, whatever perfect means. I mean, people never want to select for kindness or generosity or anything. It's always intelligence and beauty and height and things like that. Quite utilitarian traits rather than the kind of things we would actually want in a human being. What keeps drawing people back to this? We've had more than a century of it now, of the eugenics movement, kind of resurfacing in lots of strange, different manifestations. Why can people not let this go?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think like you, I'm also a fan of science fiction. I try to make sense of these puzzles by reading fiction and trying to understand why people are engaged in these kind of technologies and what they think they're going to get out of them. But of course, this always ends up in the dystopian kind of category of fiction where you see, oh, they figured out actually that this is not a good idea, but it's too late by the time they figure it out. So I don't know if we're heading down that path, the folks who are interested in these kind of technologies, but it's certainly a fear I have about when you make technologies, the fact that it's possible to monetize them. And then what is the incentive structure there? Is the incentive to be responsible and to communicate things clearly about what they actually can deliver or what the risks are that are inherent with the technology? Or is the incentive to just sell as many of your product as possible?
Yeah. So you write, and I'm just quoting from your book here, you write that scientists can disagree, but ultimately the data will lead us to the truth. And these days, I feel, the truth can feel like a very slippery thing in the era that we're in. But it's also easy to forget that it is a particularly slippery thing when it comes to studying human biology, because our bodies, as you said, are not purely biological. We're not dealing with pure facts. We're dealing with the fact that every individual body is shaped by the world around it, and that is an ongoing thing. It's not a static thing. So how do you then, as a biologist, go about understanding what is truth when it comes to human nature?
That's a great question. I think really we just have to be very honest about what the limitations are of what we can understand at the biological level and not sort of overestimate and oversell what biology can tell us. I think genetics and biology is incredibly powerful. I'm not trying to say it isn't, but the way that it gets oversold can really create harm. So I think we do need to be cautious about trying to think 3 steps ahead. If I got this wrong, what would be the potential outcome of this misconception?
Yeah, but there is disagreement within biology itself. There are so many different controversies, different strands of thinking. Then for you, as someone who has positioned herself very squarely in a certain camp on that spectrum, what is it like then communicating with other biologists in your field who may not agree with your position?
One of the wonderful things about working in academia is that people are used to having kind of civilized discourse, even if you don't agree, which I think civil discourse is something that maybe we could all use more of these days. But, we do base our conversations in facts. And so, if you have a disagreement, then you go back to the evidence. And I think that that's a skill that we should all be practicing more and thinking about how the evidence impacts our own lives and our own decision making.
And how do we do that now in the political time that we're in? Because we see the kind of the health misinformation, for instance, the scientific misinformation that spreads is not just, it's very smart these days because it takes advantage of certain facts. So, for example, people who are anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitant will find cases of vaccine injury, genuine cases, and then use that to kind of push their message. And it becomes very difficult then to argue against it. I mean, how do you, on a practical level, have a debate with the public about, or try to communicate to the public about the fact that genetics doesn't matter so much to the person that you're going to be or that you grow into, when there are other little facts that they can draw on which seem to challenge that?
Right. I think what you're referring to is what we sometimes call anecdata, where you take it out of context, and if it supports your pre-existing belief, then you're inclined to believe it just psychologically. I think what we really need to do is, as a society, really help people tell what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation and true facts. So being able to evaluate evidence as whether it's true or not, being able to spot AI. I think people younger than me are much better at spotting AI more quickly, but all of these kinds of messages, they're going to just get more and more available. So we do need to be able to tell the difference between fact and fiction. I think just training people to be able to do that reliably is important.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. There are so many different strands in your book, and not just race, which we're kind of talking about now, but also sex and disability. And today, of course, these are equally contentious topics. One subject I know you feel very strongly about is how we define sex and what that really means. Where does the science stand on that question?
That's such an important thing for us to be thinking about, because I think society really puts a kind of false binary framework on sex and also on gender. But if we look at sex, if we look at human development, we see there's male development, there's female development, and there's also intersex development. And if we impose a binary framework, then we have a complete erasure of intersex populations. But they really exist. There are people who have aspects of male development, aspects of female development, and also aspects of intermediate development. And this is just a biological reality. Sex exists on a spectrum, and so does gender.
And why is that? Why is that not part of the political and social discourse then? Why has that been left out? And also the scientific discourse. I mean, so often scientists do, and physicians, medical researchers fall back on this idea of the binary. Is it just that it's a useful shortcut because intersex people are a minority of the population to just say, okay, this is the majority, so we'll take this as the rule? What is going on there in people's minds?
I think there's a few elements that are involved there. One is that, in terms of minority status, people who are intersex, it's probably something like 1.5%, 2% of the population. So it's about the same percent as redheads. So we all know plenty of redheads, which means we all know plenty of intersex people. But in about a generation ago or so, when children were born with intersex aspects to their anatomy, physicians did perform non-consensual surgeries. The intention was to help the child exist in a binary society. But those children went on to grow up and feel, when they found out what had happened to their body, in many cases, they started to feel, oh, this is what's been wrong my whole life. And so really, kind of delaying these non-consensual surgeries until people are old enough to be able to articulate what body they feel they should be in. And, if there's no medical necessity, if there's no risk of cancer or anything like this, then if it's just plastic surgery at that point. So then why are they doing that to a baby?
Yeah. And I mean, a debate, I think, is only just emerging within the sciences with more introspection around intersex traits and understanding of sex being more of a spectrum, is how does that complicate those binary categories as well? How, in what way has the definition of maleness broadened or the definition of femaleness broadened? Because I do think for many of us, and I feel this myself, I very often feel that it doesn't really matter to me that I'm woman. I don't want society to care what gender I am. Why is it that we care so much and that we we prescribe these very kind of narrow rules around what someone is, when of course we know from our own personal experience that there is a huge amount of physical variety within these categories, that they're not, as rigid as we imagine them to be.
I think that's such an important observation, and I also think it connects to some of the work that you're in progress doing right now and thinking about labels and how humans identify themselves. And, these labels are hugely important. If you think about sports, for an example, the label that you identify as may or may not match the label that you're allowed to compete as. And that creates real harm. And the other thing that gets lost, I think, a lot of times when we talk about the binary in the context of sports is there's elite athletes and then there's just people who want to play for fun. And why are you preventing anybody from just enjoying and community and making connections with other humans? And in elite sports, there's no perfect way. They've tried so many different things in trying to enforce a binary, and none of these things work because it's not actually a binary.
Yeah, so what would be your answer to this? Because I feel that this is one of these social questions that really does divide people right across this political spectrum. It's not just a left-right issue anymore. How do we reorganize things like sport in such a way that allows everyone to play and doesn't leave people out?
I think there is no one-size-fits-all kind of answer for this. I think we need to really be considering how it plays out in the context of any given competitive sport. I once read that even darts is separated according to gender, which I have no idea why darts would be separated according to gender. But maybe some sports, they have weight categories. So how about weight categories or height categories? Why does it have to be based on the sex of the person? And then they constantly conflate sex and gender as well in these contexts. So I think, we need to kind of sort of figure out what the competitive categories are that make sense for the sport itself.
Yeah, okay. And then coming to disability, because this is another big feature of your book, you write that around a quarter of Americans live with a disability. And of course, many of us who don't may well come to live with a disability later in life. How have medical attitudes to disability changed over the last century? Because there's been a profound shift. Everything we're talking about, whether we're thinking about race, whether we're thinking about sex, there has been an evolution in the way that scientists imagine these things. But disability, I think, is such an obvious one, because that stigma that used to surround disability 100 years ago, which meant that almost, there was almost this conceptual erasure of anyone who wasn't fully able, has thankfully, we don't live in that world anymore, which is an amazing thing.
I do think there are some areas in the world where that still exists, and I think there's this framework that has really helped me understand this a lot is the medical versus social framing of disability. So the medical framing of disability would be if somebody uses a wheelchair and they want to climb a set of steps, then the problem is that their legs don't work to help them climb the steps. But the social model of disability would be that the stairs are inaccessible and somebody should install a ramp. And so I think that this medical model of disability is actually still pretty prevalent in the medical world. And I believe that's in part because of the vast underrepresentation of physicians and healthcare providers who have disabilities themselves. So if we, the more we can diversify the helping professions, the more people will be aware of what the needs are of different communities so that we can start to address some of those social gaps and move more in that direction of the social model of disability.
And it is intriguing how that shift happened, because like I said, it wasn't that long ago in history that disabled people were completely dismissed. There was this idea that, why should society have to reorganize itself around them? There's a wonderful documentary, I'm sure some of you have seen it, Crip Camp, which is just beautiful. It shows that moment in time when this shift was happening, that suddenly American society realized that we do have to reorganize things, we have to redesign everything. And even though it felt at the time like a huge imposition, now it feels so natural. It feels, of course there should be accessible bathrooms for everybody. Of course there should be ramps everywhere. We take it as given that these things should exist. How is it that attitudes were able to change like that? I mean, how did that happen?
I think one of the things that's really helped us is as we make these accommodations to recreate the social spaces for people with disabilities, we start realizing actually these accommodations are better for everyone. If you make a cutout in the sidewalk to allow a wheelchair user to come up onto the sidewalk, that's great for somebody pushing a stroller too. And if you allow captions on your programming, then that's really great when the baby's sleeping and you want to watch Netflix anyway. You know, the accommodations are helpful for everybody, and this is the concept of universal design that I think if we can lean into that, what's good for minoritized populations is actually good for everyone, then we will all be uplifted by this.
And so do you think that will also happen with regards to sex and gender, that now that we see these categories as multiple rather than binary, that things that feel like an imposition now in terms of reorganizing sport or reorganizing restrooms will in future generations come to be seen as, you know, obvious, that, you know?
Yeah, I do think that's true because for instance, if you're thinking about healthcare, gender affirming care for people who are trans, they may be taking hormones and that might impact, for instance, let's say a reproductive cancer risk. And the gender affirming hormones may influence how their risk profile looks. Understanding the biology behind that will also help us understand hormone replacement for people who are postmenopausal. Or, you know, these lessons can be applied to so many populations. So there's many, many reasons to try to understand how things impact different minoritized groups.
And, you know, we have about 15 minutes or so before we go to questions. And I want to just tell you again, please use the Slido app. Ask as many questions as you like. These are such kind of politically current topics right now, so I'm sure all of you are thinking about these things. But just coming back to you, what I really want to understand is how asking these questions, working in this space for as long as you have, how has it changed your attitudes, the way that you think about yourself and your life?
I think really coming to these questions with, you know, the starting point of saying, I don't know the answers, and I want to listen to people who have lived experience. Being around students all day, every day, is a great way to be able to get in that frame of mind and to learn from people who are coming from so many different lived experiences. And they are very willing to share, which is a good thing. And yeah, that's been really coming to it with like humility and curiosity together, I think, is the combination that allows that learning to happen.
And I mean, I'm just reflecting on my own experience here of when I wrote my books on sex and gender and then on race, it really made me question my own identity and my attachment to my identities and, you know, radically reshape the way that I described myself or even I thought about myself. You know, has that happened to you, or were you already starting from a point where you were asking these questions at such a young age anyway? So, you know, you didn't have to take that journey.
I think that I kind of went on that journey in advance to writing the book because I was sort of having this internal dialogue with myself as a young academic, and you know, really reflecting on these conversations that I was having more off in the margins with my students, and they are definitely in this phase of life that they're doing a lot of identity formation, personal identity formation, and professional identity formation.
And what is that like among your students? Because I feel there's a huge generational gulf, and I'm definitely on the other side of that. I'm not on the young side of that, I'm on the other side. And it can be really strange. You know, when I hear my son who's 12, the way that he thinks about sex or the way that he thinks about gender or race is completely different to the way that we used to imagine it growing up. What kind of conversations are you having with your students?
You know, sometimes they're in this space where they're questioning their own identities. So we're having conversations about them seeking, you know, understanding their own truth. And so, you know, I just get to be a fly on the wall or a sounding board during those conversations and understand more about the kinds of questions that are part of their internal dialogue. And then that reflects back on, you know, well, how does that relate to how I think about my own identity? And as I was coming up in the context of my professional spheres, I was really nervous actually about being just myself at work. I felt like I had to be Dr. Science all the time. But then as I got more comfortable in my professional spaces, after I felt like, okay, maybe I've earned a little bit of credibility after being here for a minute, then I started to feel like, okay, it's going to be safer to dip my toe into having some of these personal conversations more openly. And then the feedback was just very positive because the students were wondering these same things, and it just kind of grew from there.
Yeah, and what about your colleagues then? How did they receive that?
My colleagues are just like all humans, a total spectrum. Some folks who were really excited to be able to have these conversations, and others were truly terrified. You know, it does require a certain amount of vulnerability to put yourself out there. Yeah. And these classes are not necessarily small ones. The medical student classes can be 150 to 180 students. So you really have to, you know, be willing to be wrong, be willing to be vulnerable. And I think if students see that you're coming to this with, you know, with an open heart, they can tell the difference between that kind of a mistake, if you make that kind of a mistake, versus somebody who's steamrolling.
And do you find, you know, the way that we teach science often is as a series of facts. You know, these are facts that you have to memorize, and then you understand what science is. And of course, by the time you get to the undergraduate level or graduate level, you start to realize that that's not how science works. It's a process, and it's an iterative one. So there are things that people believed 50 years ago that they don't believe anymore. There, you know, there's an update that often happens. So when you talk about these topics with your students, are they looking for certainties? Are they looking for answers? Or are they willing to live in that uncertain space, the fact that things may change later on?
The uncertain space, I think, is really deeply uncomfortable. And it really, I think, depends on what you want to do with the information. Because if your goal is to become a research scientist, the uncertainty is where you live. You're thinking about how to ask and answer questions the whole time. But if your goal is to treat your patient, uncertainty is very uncomfortable because you don't know how best to care for your patient. So I do think it depends on what the context is.
Right. Yeah, I didn't study medicine, I studied engineering when I was at university, but having written about medicine, I sometimes feel that it is more like engineering than any of the other sciences because, you know, there are a million different ways to build a bridge. What matters is that you get to the other side, and medicine can sometimes be like that. There are lots of different ways to get the outcome that you need in a patient. Sometimes just give them a sugar pill and they'll get there. And sometimes that's very mysterious. It can be quite opaque, the journey to get to the outcome that you want.
I think we're moving into an era where it'll be less algorithmic, less try A, if A doesn't work, try B, and more understanding what is in our genomes or what is actually a risk factor from exposure in the environment or other factors, systemic racism and other things, access to healthcare. As we start uncovering all of these triggering factors, then doctors will be able to factor all of this in making really carefully personalized recommendations. So I think that's the future of medicine, and we're heading in that direction now.
But do you think the focus is still too much on the genetics proportion than the social one? You know, than the environmental factors, the social factors, the cultural reasons why people suffer ill health. Where do you think the balance is in the right place now, or does it need to move?
I think right now, in the context of medicine, the genetic tests that are clinically validated are actually relatively conservative. They have to be really fairly impactful and predictive to be able to be used in the clinical context. The ones that have more of the danger zone kind of things are the polygenic scores and things that are offered just for cost, not the kinds of things that are covered by insurance, not the sorts of things that your PCP would order.
But I do worry sometimes that even well-intentioned, progressive scientists can sometimes, trying to reach for a technical solution to social health problems, can fall back on the same kind of answers that people would have given 30 or 40 years ago, but in a new way. So polygenic risk scores is one, but also I see people use epigenetics as an explanation, I think more than they can stand up. And it's just coming back to genetics, essentially. You know, it's still dismissing the social element and saying there is something fundamentally biological going on. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about epigenetics?
So to take the example of epigenetics, this is kind of a change that can happen, a chemical change, modification to your DNA that can happen potentially upon exposure to different chemicals in your environment or stressors. Some people have talked about things like a poverty signature. There's even studies that suggest, for instance, if a population goes through a period of famine, then generations afterwards, the bodies continue to store fat just in case, in case for a rainy day. The actual biological mechanism of something like that is really not well defined. There's no test that you can do to say, oh, if I just look for this methylation mark on this little segment of DNA, then I'll understand exactly what's happening. There's no such clear-cut signature. It's just really a lot of theory at this point. There's probably something to it because it does seem to be transmitted for at least a certain number of generations, but the mechanics of that is still very nebulous.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes, and I just obviously have to talk about the political moment that we're in. It's a very, very strange time. This is the end of the summer. We're going back, starting the fall semester now, and it feels very weird, very, very weird. There's so much uncertainty. How has that impacted you, especially working in this space, doing what, Trump hates, the Trump administration hates, diversity and inclusion? How do you keep doing that work, or have you had to abandon it?
So you described it as weird, and I would also say maybe even dark. There are some places where it's very hard to have these conversations, but I think that means that we need to have them even more. There's certainly an interest in having these conversations, but there's also a question about whether it's safe to have the conversation. So what I'm hoping is that the book will give people some resources to have the conversation, even if they don't feel safe to have the conversation openly at work or at school. Maybe there's a way they can find some reliable information and talk about it more privately with trusted people. Because I do think we really need to kind of wrap our minds around these concepts. And the reason I feel that it's important for us to have a better grapple on what the truth actually is because if we don't understand the truth, then we won't know how to change things. We'll just be stuck in this loop where people continue to be marginalized and harmed. But if we understand why that's happening, then we can design interventions more effectively.
And so how do you push back against the cuts, against everything that's happening, this assault on higher education? What is it like on the inside, and what can really be done to protect the research that's already been done or the work that's already in motion?
It is very chaotic. There's a lot of turbulence right now on the inside. There's a lot of fear about grants being cut. And there's also a sense, I would say, among trainees, like, is this career worth it, right? Because they see the struggles everybody's going through to try to secure funding. And so, I have a lot of wonderful students. I see a few in the audience even. And the message that I really want to convey to them is just how much they belong, how much their voices are important in this conversation, and the fact that we'll do better science and we'll be able to help society better if they stay in science. And I'm here to try to figure out how to help them stay in science. That's my mission.
It does feel, though, that there's this huge contraction happening, not just within higher education on the funding side, but just generally, right here in Boston and Cambridge, you can see, even prior to actually Trump coming back into power, there is a squeeze happening right across the pharma industry, biotech, everywhere. And it's frightening. It does feel as though we're gearing up for something much worse.
I hope that we can, quickly move to the next phase. I do think one of the things that I found very striking in your most recent book, actually, that's relevant here is just how quickly the pendulum can swing back and forth. And so I'm hoping that this particular swing in this direction will rapidly reverse course.
Oh, I hope so. And of course, very quickly, I just want to say there will be people here who are directly affected by the cancellation of NIH grants. What would you advise people who work in this space, whose research projects that they applied to do, look at the kind of questions that you're looking at? What should they be doing now?
Well, one of the things that I think that we should be careful about is not complying in advance. I think we've seen that doesn't work. So we need to stay true to our own values and think about ways in which we can still move the mission forward, whether that's doing it a little bit more covertly or, kind of thinking about ways that we can navigate and still be within the rules. But this work continues to be incredibly important, and just shying away from it is not actually helping anyone.
Thank you so much. We have got lots and lots of questions, so I'm going to go slightly early to the questions, just because I want to have everyone's voices heard as much as possible. So I'm scrolling through. So here's a good one. In this case, in case this doesn't get covered, and we have touched on it very briefly, but I think it's worth exploring in more detail because people are fascinated by this question. What is the role of genetics and biology in intergenerational trauma?
Yes, this is a great question, and it kind of goes back to what we were thinking about with the poverty signature, for instance. Epigenetics may have some explanation for some of these things, but it just remains really fairly ill-defined at this point. So understanding more about that is going to take the kind of studies that maybe are on the chopping block right now, but really kind of thinking about communities that have been harmed, building trust, having proper community engagement so that people feel safe, allowing us to study their traumatic experiences so that we can understand how to minimize the harm that happens.
And how do you go about studying the biology of that then, the biological impact of something like that? Where do you start with that question?
There's actually some really wonderful work being done at Princeton in the Murphy Lab that's looking at exposure to pathogens in a model organism that's a nematode, a worm. And in that worm, upon exposure to a toxic pathogen, the worms remember to avoid that pathogen for 4 generations. Wow. So you can study these things even in these little 3-millimeter worms that you can begin with. So you don't have to start with a really complex human environment that is, incredibly hard to tease apart all the different variables, but you can do it in a more controlled way and then grow from there.
And that does raise really fascinating questions then about how universal what we think of as very human traits actually are in the animal kingdom. We think of ourselves as a species apart. In that sense, we're not as far apart as we imagine ourselves to be.
That's so true.
Okay, another question. Can you please comment, and this is a very topical question because it's been in the news lately, can you please comment on the social perception of neurodivergence as a disability versus a difference?
Thank you so much for that question. I really do think this is an important framing, is thinking about disability and whether you're framing it as a difference or as a deficit. And when it comes to neurodivergence, the framing of difference just means, we all have different ways of viewing the world, we all have different ways of interacting with each other. That's the difference framework. The deficit framework would be like those parents who I was telling you about were trying to select against another child with autism. So really kind of teasing apart those two different frameworks helps us understand the inherent hierarchy in our belief system and who we value and what we value.
Lovely. So there are a number of questions here. I'm just looking through. There are a lot of questions, but a lot of them converge on this one topic of race. One of them asks, what is the relationship, if any, of genetics and race? And another one asks, is it true that humans have evolved biologically as they migrated across the continents and populated the world? If yes, in what ways have humans evolved? And there's a number of questions in that vein. How do you go about disentangling that? Because obviously we can look around the world. We are not, how we look, phenotypic traits are not random. There is some similarity based on populations across continents. So what does race mean in that context, race and biology?
I think the thing that really happens when people are trying to understand the biology of human populations, particularly with respect to race, is that, as kids growing up, we look around and we see people with different skin tones, we see people with different hair textures, and we know those are biologically encoded traits. So then our brains take a shortcut and say, well, everything else must also be biological. So therefore, people who look different from me are probably different in many other ways too. But that's where the error of thinking actually comes in. Because we have been able to look at genomes of people from many different parts of the world, what we've seen actually is that 99.9% of our DNA is the same, and that 0.1% that's different does not fall along racial lines. Those differences are present across many different populations, and the differences are continuous around the globe. There's no place you can draw a line on the globe that says on this side of the line everybody has trait A, and on the other side everybody has trait B. We're not homogeneous. The variation is continuous. There's no way to use biology to describe individual populations that differ like that.
And so what do medical researchers do with that? Because you will know race and ethnicity are commonly used in medical research as a way of dividing up patients for study. What is a better way of doing that? Should they just not do that anymore and think of a different way of thinking about patients?
Race still continues to be an important thing to study because even though race isn't biological, it's still real. And it can still have health impacts, for sure. Exposure to structural racism is one way in which that can happen. So including race in the medical literature and in study design continues to be important, but we need to recognize and be careful that we're not using that in a way to try to make biological conclusions. So there have been some recommendations that have come out recently. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have convened a few panels of experts who have put together multiple different studies, not only on race, ethnicity, and ancestry, but also on sex and gender, and how we think about representation of these population descriptors in the context of research, and how we can use those labels responsibly and not as proxies for biological variables.
Okay, so just use them as the same way that we would think about class. You know, we don't these days. During the early eugenics movement, people really did think about class as a biological variable, but we don't do that now. So something similar would have to happen then around race, that conceptually we think of it as a social variable rather than a biological or a genetic one.
Right, and honestly, understanding race from the social point of view, that can really help us understand the right intervention, say for a public health kind of intervention. Yeah. We might say for a community defined by race, maybe they're having trouble accessing healthcare, so the public health intervention should be related to increasing access to healthcare as opposed to a pill.
I have to say though, as a journalist, it is routine for me to see medical researchers using race as a biological variable and looking for genetic differences between racial and ethnic groups. It's so widespread now, and this isn't a right-wing thing. This is right across the spectrum, and often by very well-meaning researchers. It feels like very little progress has been made on that front, and if anything, that people fall back on this approach more than ever in a kind of misguided attempt to solve racial inequalities, looking at genomes when they should be looking at, you know, how people live and how they're treated.
That's absolutely true. Yes, I think that's quite true. And two things come to mind. One is the whole peer review process. So when a well-intentioned researcher perhaps communicates something, maybe they set up their study design because they want to understand healthcare disparities, and that's why they're, with good intention, including racial descriptors in their study design. But something is kind of lost in translation when they communicate their results and they don't contextualize it properly and sort of disentangle the biological from the social. Well, then peer review should pick that up. Peer review should push back at that point and say, you haven't explained this properly. And that needs to happen before it becomes public, because there was an example of a paper that came out recently looking at a study describing a lot of diverse genomes in the All of Us study. And one of the figures of the paper, the way they did the statistical analysis emphasized difference. And that's the whole purpose of that type of analysis, is to zero in on the difference and then emphasize it. But if you take the figure out of context, it makes it seem like race is biological. And so that is very scary because, first of all, it wasn't properly contextualized. And then secondarily, people will pull that kind of image, take it out of context, and put it on the dark web and start circulating those kind of harmful agendas.
And in that sense, do you see then a problem within the sciences of that reckless, irresponsible, you know, a study approach, but also communication of results? I mean, it's a real problem, and for the life of me, I can't understand why it persists in a world in which I know many of these researchers want to improve things, want to improve patient health and reduce inequities, but the way they're going about things actually risks making things worse.
I think that's true. That's a honest risk of some of these kinds of study designs. And I don't think that, I would say maybe that it's not so much being reckless, but it's just having knowledge gaps. Whether the knowledge gap is not understanding the potential harm or the specific nuance to the interpretation of the data, or just not having the savviness of being able to communicate such complex topics. So I think, when we engage in communication of these results, the kind of training that we go through to become scientists, we need to be thinking about communication as an inherent, really important aspect of that as well.
So there are quite a number of questions here about the political climate that we're in and how to respond to that, which I know, especially now, like I said, going back into the fall semester, so many people are thinking about. So here it says, sorry, let me just find that again. Do you see your students who want to write about minoritized communities facing barriers to their research? And what would you advise to students under those circumstances? Are you suggesting to them that they redesign their studies or that they use different language? What is the way forward? How do you keep doing this work now?
Yeah, that's so important. And I think the advice is going to be varying depending on the individual student's situation. I hate to say it, but if a student is in a vulnerable position with respect to immigration, you might advise something a little bit differently than somebody who has more resources and more stability. So, it has to be a case-by-case thing. And sort of for a student who's in a vulnerable position in the earliest days of their career, not wanting to put yourself fully out there is not a cowardly thing to do. You have to rely on the people who are senior to you to help you and keep you safe.
So in practical terms then, what would you, for example, if somebody is looking at doing health research on a minoritized community, if their proposal was hitting all those keywords that not so long ago the National Institutes of Health was encouraging them to use, what should they be doing now?
Oh, there's a lot of rewriting happening in offices right now, but rewriting to try to keep the work going, but slip through all the different, all the nets that they're trying to catch us in.
Yeah, because in that sense, a lot of what the administration is doing is quite blunt. They're just looking for keywords. All you have to do is change the keywords,
yes,
and then you can keep doing what you're doing. Okay, there's also a few questions here about your book itself. So I just want to go through those because I think people are fascinated about the experience of writing this and what it's been like since it came out, because it's been some months now. Which of your arguments have faced the most pushback? And I know this from personal experience, what that feels like. What has it been like for you? And where has that pushback come from? Has it been from the sciences or from, everyday public,
right,
politics?
That's a great question. I think there have been a little bit of pushback from all camps. And I think that some folks who read the book feel as if I'm calling them out as professionals and saying, you should have done better. But that is not at all the intention of the book. The arc that I try to follow in the book is to say, these are the things that I've learned over the years. This was my journey. And also it's the journey of scientists in general, because we haven't known many of these things until recently. Having the ability to sequence DNA kind of changed everything. It's really revolutionized how we do science. And so having access to more knowledge about human genetic variation across populations is a pretty recent thing. And so when people kind of in the pre-genome sequencing era say, well, we weren't acting in a racist fashion, or we weren't acting in a biased fashion. Of course they weren't. They were using the best information they had possible. And we're all learning together, and we can all do better as we all learn together.
Another thing I want to ask you, because I certainly felt this myself when my books came out, is that as a woman of color writing on this topic, do you get a response from people along the lines of, oh, well, you would say that? Are you taken less seriously because people assume that you are coming at this from a political position rather than a scientific one?
That's such an interesting question, because I also think that in this era, in this moment in history, not only do I have my identity as part of the equation, but I also have an academic credential, which I think in some communities is actually a negative thing. So I think they're sort of saying, well, why would I listen to that liberal elite, college professor? And it's almost like a disqualifying event in some ways, perhaps as significant as being a woman of color to some communities. And so I think that, there is a little bit of that going on. And I remember I have a wonderful colleague who invited some activists who work on behalf of trans communities. And these advocates, what they were saying is that they focus their energy on this cohort of people called the movable middle. And that is, people that you can talk to who perhaps they're on the other side of the political fence, but only because they haven't been able to access truthful information. And so if you can give them access to facts, then they start moving. And then they can reach out to further down the spectrum and they can say, you know what I learned, and start bringing those folks. But if we go to the far end of the spectrum ourselves, then it's much harder to have that credibility from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think for me personally, leaving social media was the kind of turning point, because you realize that you're just having debates with people who are not there in good faith and really aren't there to be convinced. When I do think you're right, the majority of people are uncertain about most things. They're open to persuasion. And we don't spend any time on that because they tend not to be the loudest voices online. So there are two questions here which are closely connected, so I'll ask them together. While this book is accessible to a lay audience, and it's a testament to your ability to write so clearly on this topic that even an academic book feels that way, who did you hope would read it? And another question that's related, what do you hope readers will take away from reading your book, particularly those who are not academics, medical professionals, or researchers?
I really wanted to make the book accessible to anybody who's at all interested in science. If you've had high school exposure to science, then you should be able to pick it up. Somebody who might watch a NOVA program or read an article in the New York Times with interest in science. Because a lot of these topics are things that are directly relevant to our day-to-day lives. And yet we've never learned them in school, and it can be scary to talk about them. So I'm hoping that this catalyzes conversations of importance and allows people to think about how it's relevant for their day-to-day lives. So really, everybody from future scientists, practicing scientists and physicians, to people who are thinking about how to set up their classrooms, to social workers, to lawyers or technologists or venture capitalists even, anybody who's interested in these topics, I think there's relevance in everybody's spheres.